In a trauma hospital, blood is just a biological fluid. You learn to scrub it out of your scrubs, mop it off the linoleum floors, and ignore the metallic smell of it hanging in the air. But when the most dangerous man in Boston bleeds, it isn't just biology. It is a warning. I didn't know that yet. At 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday, my biggest concern was the industrial coffee machine in the St. Catherine's Hospital cafeteria. It was sputtering, leaking lukewarm brown water onto the counter. I wiped my forehead with the back of my wrist, ignoring the ache in my lower back. I was supposed to be in my third year of physical therapy and nursing rotations right now. Instead, after my parents died, I was working double shifts in the cafeteria to pay for my younger sister's medical school tuition in Philadelphia. I grabbed a stack of paper cups, intending to refill the station, when the emergency alarms triggered. It wasn't the standard code blue for cardiac arrest. It was a code yellow, followed immediately by a code black. Internal security threat. Hospital lockdown. Before the automated voice could finish its second loop over the intercom, the heavy glass doors of the cafeteria were shoved open. 4 men walked in. They were not security guards. They wore tailored black suits over tactical vests, their eyes scanning the room with the lethal mechanical efficiency of apex predators. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running down his neck, locked the cafeteria doors from the inside and stood in front of them, his hand resting casually inside his jacket. The 3 remaining nurses, who were eating late-night salads, froze. A doctor dropped his fork. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating, and heavy with terror. Then, he walked in. He didn't push the doors. One of the men scrambled to hold them open for him. He was towering, at least 6'4", built with the broad, dense musculature of a man who fought for a living rather than in a gym. He wore an immaculate, charcoal-tailored suit, the fabric rich and undeniably expensive, but the jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a subtle, dark stain spreading across his white dress shirt. Blood. But it wasn't the blood that made the air in the room grow cold. It was his face. He had striking, aristocratic features, high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and pale, ice-blue eyes. But those eyes were dead. There was no warmth in them, no humanity, only a violent, vibrating tension, as if he were a bomb with a shaved-down trigger. This was Dante Russo, the head of the Russo syndicate, a man who owned half the politicians in the city and had allegedly buried the other half. "Where is he?" Dante's voice was low, a dark, gravelly rumble that didn't need volume to command absolute obedience. His right-hand man, Nicholas, stepped forward, looking panicked. The pediatric ward said he bolted down the east stairwell. Boss. He hates hospitals. The doctors tried to set the bone without letting him see the x-ray first, and he panicked. The security cameras tracked him to the cafeteria. Dante didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, and the muscle in his jaw ticked. "Find my son. If anyone scares him, I will break their legs." The men scattered, checking behind the counter, tearing open the pantry doors, overturning chairs. The hospital staff huddled together in the corner, terrified. I stood perfectly still behind the coffee counter, my hands gripping the stainless steel edge. Then, I heard it. A tiny, muffled sniffle. It came from beneath the heavy steel prep table, located just behind the industrial ovens. I turned my head slowly. In the shadow of the metal legs, pressed as far back against the wall as physically possible, was a little boy. He couldn't have been older than 6. He wore a navy blue coat that was too warm for the indoor heat, and he was clutching his right arm against his chest. His small face was pale, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat. His eyes, wide and terrified, were locked onto me. "Boss!" Nicholas called out, pointing toward the kitchen area. "Under the prep table." Dante moved. He didn't walk. He stalked. When he reached the counter, he didn't bother walking around it. He vaulted over the stainless steel barrier with a terrifying, fluid grace, landing silently just a few feet away from me. The sheer physical presence of the man up close was overwhelming. He smelled of rain, expensive cologne, and iron. He dropped to one knee, looking under the table. His massive frame blocked out the light. "Marco," Dante said. His voice was supposed to be gentle, but he was a man who didn't know how to be soft. The violent adrenaline was still rolling off him in waves. "Come out here! Let the doctor fix your arm!" The little boy, Marco, shrank further back into the shadows. He shook his head violently, his good hand curling into a tiny fist. "No! They have needles! I don't want the needles!" "Marco!" Dante's voice lowered, the authoritative edge bleeding through. "Do not disobey me! You are a Russo! We do not hide under tables! Come out!" It was the worst possible thing to say to a terrified, injured child. I watched as Marco's breathing hitched, his small chest heaving. He was on the verge of a full-blown panic attack. He pressed himself so hard against the wall I thought he might try to phase through it. Dante reached his large hand under the table to grab his son's jacket. Marco let out a piercing shriek of pure terror and kicked out, his small shoe hitting Dante's wrist. Dante froze. For a man who controlled the underworld, he suddenly looked completely, utterly helpless. He didn't know what to do. He was a weapon, and you cannot use a weapon to comfort a crying child. I couldn't take it anymore. "Stop it!" I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the kitchen, it sounded like a gunshot. Nicholas, who had just stepped behind the counter, snapped his hand to his holster. Dante slowly turned his head, his ice-blue eyes locking onto me. The look he gave me would have made a lesser woman drop to her knees and apologize. It was a look that promised a very cold, very unmarked grave. "What did you say?" Dante asked, his voice deadly quiet. I didn't look at him. I looked at Marco. I remembered my pediatric nursing rotations. I remembered that when a child is in pain, logic doesn't work. Authority doesn't work. Distraction works. I grabbed a clean paper cup, walked over to the commercial steamer, and poured a measure of whole milk. I added 2 pumps of caramel syrup, the good stuff we hid for the night shift nurses, and steamed it until it was perfectly warm, not hot. Then, I opened the staff first aid kit on the wall and pulled out a roll of green cohesive bandage wrap and a black Sharpie. I walked around Dante, completely ignoring his lethal stare. I knelt down on the sticky, dirty floor, directly in front of the prep table, blocking Dante's view of his son. "You're doing it wrong," I told the most feared mafia boss in the city, not even glancing back at him. "He's 6, not one of your soldiers." Behind me, I heard Nicholas suck in a breath. I waited for a bullet to hit the back of my head, but nothing happened. I slid under the cold steel table, entering Marco's dark, safe space. I didn't reach for him. I just sat cross-legged on the floor, placing the warm cup of caramel milk between us. Marco stopped crying, eyeing me warily. He clutched his injured arm tighter. "That looks like it hurts," I said conversationally, keeping my voice low and soft. "I'm Ellie," he sniffled. "I'm Marco. They want to put needles in me." "I know," I said. "Needles are terrible. I hate them too." "But you know who wouldn't care about a needle?" Marco blinked, a tear tracking through the grime on his cheek. "Who? A T-Rex," I said solemnly. "Because their skin is too thick, and they have tiny arms, so it would be really hard to find a vein." Marco stared at me for a long second. Then, a tiny, unexpected giggle escaped his lips. The tension in his small body dropped by a fraction. "My arm isn't tiny," he whispered. "No, it's not," I agreed. "But it is broken. And broken arms need armor, like a stegosaurus plates." I held up the roll of bright green wrap. "I have dinosaur armor right here. Do you want to see how it works?" He hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay. I'm going to reach out now. I'm not going to hurt you." Moving very slowly, I reached forward and gently supported his injured arm. His radius was fractured, a classic green stick fracture, common in kids his age. It wasn't life-threatening, but it throbbed. I expertly wrapped the green cohesive bandage around his forearm, creating a temporary, stable splint that would stop the bone from shifting until orthopedics could cast it properly. "There," I said. I uncapped the Sharpie. "Now, what kind of dinosaur are you?" "A velociraptor," he said instantly. are fast. Velociraptor it is. With a few quick strokes, I drew a cartoonish dinosaur face on the green wrap, complete with sharp teeth. Marco looked at his arm, his eyes wide with fascination. The pain was secondary now. The fear was gone. Now, I said, pushing the cup of caramel milk toward him. Velociraptors need fuel. Drink up, and then we have to go out there. Your dad is really worried about you. Marco took the cup with his good hand and took a long sip. He sighed, the warmth of the milk relaxing his tense muscles. Papa doesn't get worried. Papa is strong. Everyone gets worried, I said softly. I backed out from under the table and stood up, dusting off my cafeteria apron. A second later, Marco scrambled out from under the table. He didn't run away. He stood next to my leg, holding his green dinosaur arm proudly. Dante was still kneeling. He looked at his son, whole and relatively calm, and then he looked up at me. The dead, cold emptiness in his eyes had shifted. It was replaced by something entirely different, an intense, heavy scrutiny that felt physical, like a weight pressing against my chest. He was studying me, dissecting me, trying to figure out what kind of creature I was. He stood up, his massive frame towering over me once again. He didn't say thank you. He just reached down to pick up Marco with his right arm. That was when I saw it. It was a micro-expression, a fraction of a second. As Dante engaged his right deltoid and trapezius muscles to lift the 40-pound boy, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. A thin sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His breathing didn't change, his face remained a mask of stone, but his right shoulder locked. He was compensating, lifting Marco entirely with his bicep and forearm, bypassing his back muscles completely. My physical therapy training kicked in before my common sense could stop me. Put him down, I said. Once again, the kitchen fell dead silent. Nicholas actually groaned quietly in the background. Dante paused, holding Marco against his left side now. His blue eyes narrowed, narrowing into dangerous slits. Excuse me? I didn't back down. I looked at the way his expensive suit jacket pulled tight across his broad shoulders. You're compensating. You're holding him entirely on your left side because your right shoulder is locked. When you reach down, your trapezius spasmed. You're sweating through an $8,000 suit, Mr. Russo, and it isn't from the heat. Dante went entirely still. The air around him seemed to freeze. Nicholas took a step forward, his hand actually drawing his weapon half an inch from the holster. No one noticed the boss's pain. No one was allowed to. I crossed my arms over my cheap, stained apron. You have a massive, untreated chronic injury in your right shoulder. Nerve damage, by the look of the muscular atrophy. You're refusing painkillers because your pupils are perfectly responsive, which means you are operating in agonizing, constant pain. I stepped closer to him, ignoring the warning growl from Nicholas. If you don't start treating that injury with deep tissue release and proper physical therapy, the scar tissue will calcify. By this time next year, you won't have the mobility to lift a coffee cup, let alone your son. You might be a tough guy, but human biology doesn't care about your reputation. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. Dante stared down at me. I was 5'4". He was a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier. He could snap my neck with the very hand I was diagnosing. But he didn't. Slowly, incredibly, the rigid line of his jaw relaxed. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, just a fraction of a millimeter. It wasn't a smile. It was the realization that he had finally found something rare. You are very observant, miss. Morgan, I said, lifting my chin. Ellie Morgan. Ellie Morgan, he repeated. He tasted the name, rolling it over his tongue as if committing it to a permanent ledger in his mind. He shifted Marco fully to his uninjured side. The little boy was already half asleep, his head resting on his father's broad chest, his green dinosaur arm safely tucked between them. Take care of your arm, Marco, I said softly to the boy. Bye, Ellie, Marco mumbled into Dante's expensive shirt. Dante didn't say another word to me. He turned and walked out of the cafeteria, his men falling into perfect formation around him. As they left, Nicholas paused by the coffee counter. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick white envelope, and dropped it next to the leaking coffee machine. "For your trouble," Nicholas said, his eyes warning me not to refuse. Then he was gone, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind him. I stood in the quiet cafeteria, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I walked over to the counter and opened the envelope. Inside were 50 crisp $100 bills. $5,000. Exactly the amount I needed for my sister's tuition this semester. I should have felt relieved. I should have felt lucky. Instead, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I looked at the spot where Dante Russo had stood, remembering the intense, calculating look in his ice blue eyes before he left. It wasn't a look of gratitude. It was the look of a man who had found exactly what he didn't know he was looking for. The next morning, I walked out of my cramped apartment building into the gray Boston drizzle, pulling my worn coat tight against the chill. I had the $5,000 safely deposited in the bank, and I was ready to go back to scrubbing tables. But as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I stopped. Parked illegally in front of my building, taking up 2 spaces and blocking a fire hydrant, was a massive, heavily armored black SUV. The engine was a low, menacing purr. The rear passenger door opened. Nicholas stepped out into the rain, holding a large black umbrella. He didn't look like he was here to ask a question. He looked like he was executing an order. "Miss Morgan," Nicholas said, his voice flat and authoritative. "Get in." I gripped the strap of my canvas tote bag. "I have to get to work at the hospital." "You don't work at the hospital anymore," Nicholas said smoothly. "Mr. Russo has bought out your contract. Your sister's medical school tuition for the next 3 years was paid in full an hour ago. Your belongings in that apartment are being packed by our team as we speak." I stared at him, my mouth falling open in sheer disbelief. "You can't just do that. I didn't agree to anything." Nicholas didn't blink. He just gestured to the open door of the SUV. The plush, dark leather interior looked less like a luxury vehicle and more like a very comfortable, very inescapable trap. "Marco refuses to let the orthopedics put a real cast on him unless the dinosaur nurse is there," Nicholas explained, a hint of exhaustion breaking through his professional facade, and my brother's shoulder kept him awake until 4 in the morning. Nicholas stepped aside, holding the door open wider. "You belong to the Russo estate now, Miss Morgan. Please don't make me carry you." The Russo estate was less a home and more a fortress. Hidden behind wrought iron gates and acres of old-growth oak trees in the wealthiest suburb north of Boston, the stone mansion loomed against the gray sky, like a castle waiting for a siege. When the SUV pulled to a stop in front of the massive double doors, I still couldn't quite process how my life had been hijacked in the span of 12 hours. I stepped out onto the damp cobblestones, clutching my canvas tote. Before I could even take a full breath, the front doors flew open. "Ellie!" A small missile in a navy sweater launched itself down the stone steps. Marco crashed into my legs, throwing his good arm around my waist and burying his face in my coat. I staggered back slightly but caught him, my hands instinctively going to his back to steady him. "Hey there, little raptor," I said, smiling, despite the sheer absurdity of my situation. I glanced down at his right arm. It was encased in a proper fiberglass cast now, but the bright green cohesive bandage with my Sharpie dinosaur drawing had been carefully taped over the top of it. "I told them you were coming." Marco beamed, looking up at me. "I didn't let the doctors put the cast on until Uncle Nico promised you would be my nanny." I looked up at Nicholas, who had followed me out of the SUV. He offered a tight, unapologetic shrug. He threw a medical tray at an orthopedic surgeon. We didn't have many options. "Where's your papa?" I asked Marco, letting him take my hand to pull me inside. Marco's smile faltered just a fraction. "Papa is in his study. He's working. He works a lot." The interior of the mansion was breathtakingly opulent, but it felt cold. There were soaring ceilings, antique furniture, and spotless marble floors, but it lacked the messy, vibrant warmth of a home where a 6-year-old boy lived. It felt like a museum. Over the next few days, I made it my mission to change that. My role as Marco's live-in nanny was clearly defined. But I quickly realized what he actually needed wasn't a babysitter. He needed a mother figure. He needed normalcy. We spent the afternoon sprawled on the expensive Persian rug in the living room, surrounded by a mountain of dinosaur encyclopedias. I taught him how to bake chocolate chip cookies in the pristine chef-grade kitchen, a process that resulted in flour covering half the countertops, much to the horror of the household staff. And Dante? Dante was a ghost. I rarely saw the fearsome head of the Russo syndicate during the day. He left early and returned late. But I knew he was there. Sometimes, when I was reading to Marco on the rug, the hairs on the back of my neck would prickle. I would look up and catch a glimpse of a broad shadow retreating from the doorway. He was watching us. He was standing on the periphery of our warmth, a man too steeped in violence to believe he was allowed to step into the light. But I also knew something else. I knew he was in pain. It was a Tuesday night, exactly 1 week after I had been essentially kidnapped into my new job. Marco was asleep in his dinosaur-themed bedroom, and the massive house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. I was in the kitchen, boiling water for chamomile tea, when the heavy oak doors swung open. Dante walked in. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, the top 3 buttons of his white dress shirt undone. He looked exhausted, the sharp angles of his face cast in stark relief by the dim under-cabinet lighting. But it was the way he moved that caught my attention. His gait was slightly uneven. His right shoulder was locked, pulled tightly toward his neck, and his right hand was curled into a loose, trembling fist. He stopped when he saw me standing by the stove. The predatory mask immediately slammed down over his features. The posture straightened, the jaw set, the pain hidden behind a wall of pure intimidation. "You're up late, Miss Morgan," he said, his deep voice carrying easily across the kitchen. I poured the hot water into my mug, watching him. "It's Ellie." "And yes, I was making tea. Do you want a cup?" "I don't drink tea." He walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator, opening it to pull out a bottle of cold water. When he unscrewed the cap, I saw the hesitation in his right hand, the agonizing flare of nerve pain as he twisted his wrist. I set my mug down. "Sit down!" Dante paused, the water bottle halfway to his mouth. He looked at me as if I had just spoken to him in a foreign language. "Excuse me?" I pointed to one of the heavy wooden stools at the kitchen island. "Sit down, Dante, before you tear your rotator cuff completely." He didn't move. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, suffocating. "I am fine, Ellie. Go to bed." "You're not fine," I shot back, crossing the kitchen until I was standing just a few feet away from him. "You've been compensating for that shoulder all week. You're barely sleeping because laying down puts pressure on the scar tissue. You're in absolute agony, and you're too stubborn to admit it." His eyes darkened, a dangerous, electric blue. He took a step toward me, towering over my smaller frame, trying to use his sheer physical dominance to force a retreat. "You are a nanny, not my physician. Do not cross a line you cannot uncross." I didn't step back. I looked up at him, my heart hammering, but my voice steady. "I'm not crossing a line. I'm doing my job." Marco needs his father to be strong enough to carry him when he gets tired. Right now, you can barely open a water bottle. We stared at each other in a battle of wills. He was the most feared man in Boston, a man who commanded hundreds of armed killers. But right now, he was just a man in pain, and I was the stubborn nurse who refused to let him suffer. Slowly, the tension drained out of his massive frame. A heavy, defeated sigh escaped his lips. He walked over to the island and sat heavily on the stool, resting his elbows on the marble counter. "Take off your shirt," I said gently. He didn't argue. He reached up with his left hand and began unbuttoning his shirt, struggling slightly with the cuffs. I stepped forward and batted his hand away, efficiently unbuttoning the cuffs and peeling the expensive cotton fabric off his broad shoulders. When his back was fully exposed, I couldn't stop the small gasp that escaped my lips. It wasn't just a shoulder injury. His entire upper right back was a map of brutal, jagged scar tissue. There was a puckered, star-shaped entry wound just below his scapula, a bullet wound. The surrounding muscle tissue was knotted, inflamed, and completely locked up in a permanent, agonizing spasm. 5 years ago, Dante said quietly, his voice staring straight ahead at the marble counter. An ambush outside a restaurant. Sophia, Marco's mother, didn't make it. I took a bullet shielding Marco in his car seat. It shattered the scapula and tore through the nerve cluster. My heart ached at the flat, emotionless way he delivered the tragedy. I went to the sink, ran a clean hand towel under steaming hot water, and wrung it out. You refused painkillers, I said softly, returning to him. Painkillers make you slow, he replied, his voice hard. Slow men don't survive in my world, and they don't protect their sons. You're a stubborn idiot, I muttered affectionately. I placed the steaming hot towel directly over the scarred, knotted muscle of his right shoulder. Dante hissed sharply through his teeth, his entire body jerking forward at the intense heat. Hold still, I commanded. I went to the pantry and found a bottle of high-quality olive oil. Not traditional massage oil, but it would have to do. I returned to him, rubbing a small amount of the oil between my palms to warm it. Then, I placed my hands on his bare back. The moment my skin made contact with his, he went completely rigid. A violent shiver racked his massive frame. He hadn't been touched with simple healing intent in 5 years. Every touch he experienced in his world was either a threat, a blow, or a transactional exchange. Breathe, Dante, I murmured, pressing my thumbs deep into the inflamed trapezius muscle. Just breathe. I used the deep tissue release techniques I had mastered in physical therapy school. It wasn't a gentle spa massage. It was clinical, forceful, and deeply painful. I dug my knuckles into the calcified scar tissue, forcing the locked muscle fibers to separate and release the trapped nerves. Dante gripped the edge of the marble counter so hard his knuckles turned white. His breathing was ragged, harsh pants echoing in the quiet kitchen. But he didn't pull away. He surrendered completely to my hands. For 30 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the hum of the refrigerator and Dante's heavy breathing. Slowly, miraculously, the iron-hard knots beneath my fingers began to melt. The muscle unspooled. The fierce, agonizing tension that had held his body hostage for years finally broke. When I finished, I wiped the excess oil from his back with the hot towel. Dante slumped forward over the counter, his forehead resting on his crossed arms. He was completely limp. The dangerous, lethal Mafia Boss was gone, replaced by an exhausted, broken man who had finally found a moment of peace. How does it feel? I asked softly, stepping back. Dante slowly lifted his head and rotated his right shoulder. A look of absolute shock washed over his face. The tremor was gone. The locked, stiff posture was gone. For the first time in 5 years, the pain had receded to a dull, manageable ache. He turned on the stool to face me. The intensity in his ice-blue eyes was overwhelming. It wasn't the cold, calculating look from the hospital. It was a dark, consuming hunger, a desperate, terrifying realization that I was the only person in the world who could take his pain away. He reached out, his massive, scarred hand wrapping gently around my wrist. His thumb brushed against my pulse point, feeling the frantic, fluttering beat of my heart. Don't ever leave this house, Ellie, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. I looked down at his hand, feeling the heat of his touch seeping into my skin. I'm not going anywhere, Dante. From that night on, a silent, unbreakable routine was born. During the day, I was Marco's nanny, playing with dinosaurs and building pillow forts. But at midnight, when the house was asleep, Dante would come to my cottage on the edge of the estate. He would sit on the edge of my bed in the dim lamplight, take off his shirt, and surrender his broken body to my hands. It was our secret, a deeply intimate, quiet addiction that bound us together tighter than any chain. 6 weeks passed. The harsh Boston autumn began to bleed into a bitter winter. But inside the Russo estate, a strange, fragile warmth had blossomed. Marco's arm had healed perfectly, the green dinosaur cast replaced by a small, fading scar. He was thriving. He laughed louder, ran faster, and had completely stopped having the night terrors that Mrs. Abernathy had warned me about. Dante was changing too. The deep tissue therapy sessions every night had restored nearly full mobility to his right arm. More importantly, the absence of chronic pain had smoothed the harsh, violent edges of his personality. He smiled more often small, private smiles reserved only for Marco and me. He started joining us for dinner, listening to Marco ramble about Triceratops diets while effortlessly cutting the boy's steak with his healed right hand. We were playing house in the middle of a war zone, pretending the monsters outside the gates didn't exist. But in Dante's world, peace is just the deep breath you take before the bleeding starts. It happened on a Thursday. I was in the kitchen, helping Marco practice his spelling words at the island while the private chef prepared dinner. Dante was supposed to be home at 5 o'clock. At 5:30, he still hadn't arrived, which wasn't entirely unusual. But at 5:45, Nicholas burst through the back doors of the kitchen. He was breathing hard, his suit rumpled, a smear of black grease on his cheek. He looked at me, his eyes wide and frantic, and gave a sharp, definitive shake of his head. "Don't let the kid see." My heart dropped into my stomach. I immediately stood up, moving between Marco and the doorway leading to the garage. A moment later, Dante walked in. To the untrained eye, he looked perfectly normal. He was wearing his dark, tailored suit, his hair swept back, his expression calm and composed. "Papa!" Marco yelled, abandoning his spelling worksheet and running toward his father. Dante caught him flawlessly with his left arm, hoisting the boy up and pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Hello, Piccolo. How are your spelling words?" "I got them all right. Ellie said I can have 2 cookies after dinner." "2? We'll have to negotiate that," Dante said, his voice entirely steady. He carried Marco over to the island and set him down gently. He looked across the marble counter at me, and that was when I saw it. His face was a shade too pale. His breathing was strictly controlled, shallow and precise. He was keeping his right arm pressed firmly against his side, the dark fabric of his suit jacket hiding whatever was beneath it. But the most terrifying sign was his eyes. The warm, domestic softness that had grown over the past 6 weeks was completely gone. The lethal, dead-eyed predator from the hospital cafeteria had returned. "Ellie," Dante said, his voice perfectly even, "would you mind taking Marco to his room to wash up for dinner?" "I need to speak with Nicholas for a moment." "Of course," I said, keeping my voice light despite the panic screaming in my head. I walked around the island and took Marco's hand. "Come on, Raptor! Let's go scrub those claws." I led Marco up the grand staircase, maintaining a cheerful chatter until we reached his bedroom. I helped him wash his hands, set up a dinosaur puzzle on his rug, and promised I'd be right back to check on dinner. The second I closed his bedroom door, I dropped the smile and ran. I sprinted down the hallway, taking the back stairs 2 at a time toward Dante's ground floor study. I didn't bother knocking. I threw the heavy oak doors open. Dante was sitting in his leather desk chair, his head thrown back, his eyes closed, his breathing coming in harsh, ragged gasps. He had taken his suit jacket off. The entire right side of his pristine white dress shirt was soaked in bright, fresh blood. "Dante!" I screamed, running toward the desk. His eyes snapped open, blazing with a terrifying, primal violence. He actually reached for the gun resting on his desk before recognizing me. He dropped his hand, gritting his teeth in agony. "Get out, Ellie!" he ground out, his voice thick with pain. "Don't look at this." "Shut up," I snapped, my fear completely overridden by my nursing training. I ran around the desk, grabbing the heavy medical kit I knew Nicholas kept in the bottom drawer. "What happened?" Nicholas stepped into the study, locking the door behind him. "A hit squad from the Moretti family. They ambushed us outside a construction site. Dante shielded a civilian worker when the shooting started. Took a blade to the ribs in the close quarters fighting." "A blade?" I tore open the medical kit, pulling out sterile gloves and trauma shears. "Why aren't you at the hospital?" "Because," Dante snarled, gripping the arms of his chair as a wave of pain hit him. "If the city knows I'm bleeding, it shows weakness. Weakness invites war. Marco stays safer if the world thinks I am untouchable." You're bleeding to death in your study to keep up appearances? I demanded, slicing through his ruined shirt with the shears to expose his right side. The wound was ugly. A deep, jagged laceration running along his ribcage. It had missed any major organs, but it was bleeding heavily and needed stitches immediately. "Nicholas, get me sterile saline betadine and the suture kit," I ordered. I grabbed a stack of gauze and pressed it hard against Dante's side, applying direct pressure to stem the bleeding. Dante let out a low, guttural groan, his massive hands gripping my wrists. Not to push me away, but to anchor himself against the pain. "I killed 3 of them with my bare hands, Ellie," Dante whispered hoarsely, his eyes clouded with pain and adrenaline. He was staring at me, desperate, afraid of what I would see. "I broke their necks. I was covered in their blood before I even got in the car. I am a monster." He was trying to push me away. He had spent the last 6 weeks letting me heal his old scars. But this was fresh. This was the violent reality of his world, raw and unhidden. And he was terrified that the woman who read dinosaur books to his son would run screaming from the butcher sitting in the chair. I didn't run. I looked down at his blood-soaked hands, then up into his terrified, desperate eyes. I didn't see a mafia boss. I didn't see a killer. I leaned down until my face was inches from his. "Everyone sees the monster, Dante," I said softly, my voice steady and completely devoid of fear. "Marco just sees his papa, and I just see a man who needs a bandage." I pressed the gauze harder against his ribs. "Now hold still." Dante stared at me, the frantic, violent panic in his eyes shattering completely. A shudder ran through his massive frame, and he let his head drop forward, resting his forehead against my stomach, completely surrendering to my care. For the next 45 minutes, I was a machine. I cleaned the wound, numbed the area with local anesthetic from the kit, and expertly threw 24 neat, precise sutures into his skin to close the laceration. Dante didn't make a sound. He just sat there, his eyes closed, his breathing slowly syncing with the rhythmic, steady movement of my hands. When I finally tied off the last stitch and applied a sterile dressing, I stepped back, stripping off my bloody gloves. "It's done," I said, my voice shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "Keep it clean. No heavy lifting for 2 weeks." Nicholas let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding the entire time. He nodded to me, a look of profound, silent respect on his face, before quietly slipping out of the study to give us privacy. Dante remained in his chair. He looked exhausted, pale, but the wound was closed, and the bleeding had stopped. He slowly reached out and caught my hand, pulling me gently until I was standing between his knees. He didn't say thank you. In his world, words were cheap. Instead, he wrapped his arms around my waist, burying his face against my stomach, holding me with a desperate, crushing intensity. I ran my fingers through his dark hair, feeling the tension finally drain out of his body. "I thought," Dante murmured against my shirt, his voice raw. "I thought when you saw the blood, you would look at me the way everyone else does. With fear." I continued stroking his hair, staring out the dark window of the study. "I told you, Dante, I don't see a monster. I just see you." Spring arrived in Boston with a quiet, stubborn resilience, melting the last of the dirty snow from the cobblestone driveway of the Russo estate. Inside the mansion, the heavy, museum-like silence that had defined Dante's life for 5 years was gone. It had been replaced by the sound of Marco practicing his roar for the first-grade spring play, the smell of burnt chocolate chip cookies from my ongoing war with the commercial oven, and occasionally, the deep, rich sound of Dante's laughter. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was standing in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, attempting to tame my unruly hair into a presentable bun. Today was the day. Marco's school play. A soft knock on the doorframe made me turn. Dante leaned against the wood, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. I had to blink twice. For the first time since I met him in that terrifying hospital cafeteria, he wasn't wearing a tailored armored suit. He wore a soft charcoal cashmere sweater and dark jeans. Without the rigid lines of the suit to emphasize his status as a mafia boss, He just looked like an impossibly handsome, broad-shouldered father. But the most striking difference wasn't the clothes. It was his posture. His right shoulder sat perfectly level with his left. The tight, agonizing tension that used to lock his jaw was entirely gone. 6 months of deep tissue therapy, and perhaps the simple act of letting himself be cared for, had healed the physical and emotional scars that the bullet had left behind. "You look beautiful, Ellie," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble that sent a familiar shiver down my spine. "I look like a nurse who lost a fight with a curling iron," I corrected him, abandoning the bun and letting my hair fall loose around my shoulders. "Are you ready? Marco is going to have a meltdown if we miss his grand entrance as the T-Rex." Dante smiled, pushing off the door frame and walking toward me. "The cars are waiting. Nicholas has already secured the perimeter of the auditorium. It will be completely safe." He stopped just inches from me, reaching out to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch, once hesitant and rigid with pain, was now smooth, confident, and deeply possessive. "Thank you," he said quietly, his blue eyes holding mine with an intensity that took my breath away. "For getting ready on time?" I teased, trying to deflect the sudden, heavy, emotional weight in the room. "For everything," he corrected softly. He let his hand trail down my cheek, resting his palm against my neck, feeling the steady beat of my pulse. "For refusing to leave the cafeteria that night. For fighting me every time I tried to push you away. For fixing my back." He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against my forehead. "For fixing me." I closed my eyes, leaning into his warmth. "You weren't broken, Dante. You were just hurting." He let out a soft breath, pressing a real, lingering kiss to my lips. It wasn't the desperate, frantic touch of a man in pain. It was the slow, deliberate kiss of a man who had finally found home. "Papa!" "Ellie, we're going to be late." Marco's voice echoed impatiently from the bottom of the grand staircase. Dante pulled back, a reluctant smile playing on his lips. "We should go before the T-Rex decides to eat Nicholas." The private elementary school auditorium was packed with parents holding up smartphones and iPads. Dante and I sat in the third row. Despite his casual clothes, Dante's sheer physical presence still caused a subtle ripple of unease among the other wealthy parents, who instinctively gave us a wide berth. But Dante didn't care. He wasn't looking at the parents, and he wasn't scanning the exits for threats. He was sitting completely relaxed, his right arm resting comfortably on the back of my chair, his fingers casually playing with the ends of my hair. When the red velvet curtains finally parted, revealing a stage full of 6-year-olds dressed in brightly colored cardboard dinosaur costumes, Dante leaned forward. Marco marched to the center of the stage in a bright green T-Rex costume that looked suspiciously similar to the drawing I had done on his cast 6 months ago. He looked out into the bright lights, his small face momentarily freezing in stage fright. I held my breath. Beside me, Dante's hand tightened slightly on my shoulder. Then, Marco saw us. He saw his terrifying, invincible father, and he saw his stubborn, flower-covered nanny. We were sitting side by side, completely normal, completely safe. A massive, gap-toothed smile broke across Marco's face. He threw his tiny, cardboard T-Rex arms into the air and let out the loudest, fiercest roar a first grader could muster. The audience erupted into applause. Dante pulled me closer, pressing a kiss to the top of my head amidst the cheering crowd. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. The monster who ruled Boston was gone. In his place was a man who was finally, completely, without pain. And as I leaned against his healed shoulder, watching our little dinosaur take a bow, I knew I would never leave the Russo estate. I had found my patient, my family, and the only man in the world whose monsters I couldn't help but love.